So far, we've been defining our route actions enclosures directly within the web routes file in here. This is straightforward when you're just getting started or working on a very tiny project. However, you can probably imagine how quickly this could become cumbersome and hard to maintain as your application grows. The primary job of the route file should be to direct requests to the appropriate action, not to get bogged down with the nitty-gritty details of those actions. That is where controllers come in handy. Think of a controller in Laravel as like a chef in a restaurant. When a customer or the user places an order, the chef, which is the controller, might validate the order request, making sure that the requirements provided by the user are valid, and then start preparing the order. The chef knows which ingredients are needed and how to work with them to create the desired dish. So that desired dish is kind of like a response, and the ingredients are basically the data from the models and other services. This might involve communicating with suppliers like external APIs and coordinating with assistants and other kitchen staff like services to perform specific tasks. So instead of tossing all of your logic and request handling into closures within your routes file, you might want to use controller classes instead, which help you keep your code clean and organized. For example, let's say that we have these 4 routes in here that deal with transactions. One is to open the transactions page. The other one is to view the details about a specific transaction. One is to show a form or the UI to create a new transaction. And then one to actually create the new transaction, which is a post request, as you can see here. Now, these actions may not look big and overwhelming, but in a real application, as you can imagine, it would not look like this. It would actually have the real logic in it. We just haven't covered all of those parts of Laravel yet, so we're keeping things simple at this time. That's why we're only returning some text in here, and we don't actually have the logic to create a transaction or return transaction details and so on. So what we want to do is that we want to move all of these actions out of the web routes file and into a controller. The controllers in Laravel are stored under the HTTP controllers directory. We can either create a controller manually, or we could use Laravel's Artisan command to generate one for us. So let's open the terminal. I'm going to open the shell here. So vendor bin sail shell. Then let's run PHP artisan make controller, followed by the controller name. So we'll call it transaction controller. And here we're just following Laravel's naming convention and naming our controller in a singular form. So as you can see, we are not calling it transactions controller. We're just calling it transaction controller, and we're appending the controller at the end. So let's hit enter. This has created our transaction controller within the controllers directory. Let's open that here. And sure enough, we have that controller. So let's open that up. And the first thing that we see is that this controller extends some kind of base controller in here. This is actually not required. You can have controllers not extend anything and it will still work. The base controller is there in case you want to add some functionality that is available across all the controllers. If we inspect this controller here, we see that it's just an empty abstract class. I personally don't use the base controllers simply because I don't put the functionality here that can be reusable in other controllers, because I try not to use inheritance for code reuse. That's not what it's really for. So in general, in my Laravel applications, I simply get rid of this and I actually just delete that base controller because it's really not needed. Now it is up to you, you can keep it. There is nothing wrong with using that base controller if you wanted to extend it further down the road. The base controller was mostly useful in Laravel 10. It had some traits in there that provided some helper methods that you could use within your controllers. But that has been slimmed down in Laravel 11, and you could add them back if you wanted to. But I personally don't really use it, and that's why I don't use the extends base controller, and that's why I removed that base controller from my Laravel projects. Alright, so let's create some methods. First, we're going to create the index method to show the transactions page. So let's close this out. We'll do public function index. And here we're just going to return whatever we were returning from here. So we're just returning transactions page. So let's do that. And let's now connect the route to this method. Let's add the return type here to a string. Let's go back to the web routes file. And instead of returning the closure, now we want to connect this route to the index method of the transaction controller. So let's get rid of this. And if you took my Learn PHP the Right Way series, then you should already know how this is going to go. In here, as an action, we can pass an array that contains the controller's fully qualified class name as the first element. And the second element is the method that we want to invoke when the user visits this transactions route. So we'll do transaction controller class, and then pass the method here, which is index. And if you're using IDE like PHP Storm, then you can see that it auto-completes, and you can even click into this to go directly to that method. All right, so let's import this and let's test this out. So let's open the browser. Let's go to localhost/transactions, and sure enough, it works. It's returning the transactions page text. Now let's move all of these into the appropriate methods. So this action here, we're going to move it into a show method. So we'll do public function show, and let's return the same thing. And we need to accept the transaction ID as an argument here. So we can define that parameter the same way we're defining here. So let's take that, put it here. Let's add the return type, and let's get rid of this. And we'll replace it with transaction controller show. Let's do the same thing for this. We're going to move this into a create method. So let's do public function create and return that. And we need one more that's going to be public function store to actually store or create that transaction. And we're going to return this string, and let's replace this with transaction controller store, and we'll replace this with transaction controller create. All right, and as you can see, this looks a lot cleaner than what it did before when we were using closures. Also, notice that we are using the dependency injection here the same way we were using in the closures in the web routes file before. Laravel will basically try to resolve the class using the service container. Now, in addition to being able to inject the dependencies within the methods, you could also inject the dependencies within the constructor as well. So let's say you had some kind of service class like a transaction service or invoice service class that you were using in multiple methods in here, maybe within the show method and the store method. In that case, you could, yes, inject them directly into the show and store method, but you could also inject it into the constructor and define it as a property and then access it in all the methods that you need to. I personally recommend injecting dependencies into the constructors, but dependencies like request, for example, I recommend injecting it directly into the method because it doesn't make sense to have a request injected into a constructor that you're not going to need in all the other methods and you only need it in one method. So typically you would be injecting the request and response classes along with the models in future within the controller methods and inject other dependencies like services within the constructor. But again, that is up to you. You could inject the services within the methods as well. I'm just explaining things the way I usually do things. All right, so before we test these out, I just want to note the naming of these methods, like why are we naming this show? Why are we naming this create and store? We're basically following the typical RESTful, resourceful naming conventions here, the standard CRUD operations that we're defining here. If we had a delete route, we would create a destroy method for it, and so on. All right, so let's test some of them out now. So let's open the browser. Let's visit transactions 123. That works. Let's visit transactions create. And we're getting internal server error stating that the argument 1 must be of type int. Now, if we go back to controller, this may not make sense because we're defining the create here and we're saying that this is for the create method, and the create method doesn't have the transaction ID. However, for some reason, it is invoking the show method. And that's because this route right here is overriding this route here, because essentially the create is being treated as like a transaction ID. And we haven't defined any constraint here to indicate that this has to be only numeric. So let's add that constraint here where number transaction ID. Let's go back and refresh. And now as you can see, it works because this no longer matches the ID that has to be a number. And therefore Laravel checks to see if there is any other route that matches this and then invokes the action for that. If you didn't want to do this, another way that you could fix is by simply moving this above the more generic or general definition. So now Laravel will match this first when you pass create, and then anything else you pass after the transactions, it is going to match this route because it is going to think that you're passing the transaction ID. So if we go back and refresh, this still works. And if we pass something else other than create, then it is matching the other route. Sometimes you might want to have a controller that handles one specific action or has one specific job. For example, in this case, we have a transaction controller that has 4 methods, but sometimes you want to have single action controllers. That's what we really call them. They're called single action controllers, where their only responsibility is to do one thing. They are great when you want to keep your controllers simple and straightforward without multiple actions being crammed into one controller. Single action controllers typically just have a single action method that is routed through the router. It can have more methods, of course, depending on the needs, but only one method would be routed, and that method would be the PHP's magic invoke method. That's what makes it invocable single action controllers. Invoke method would be called whenever an object or an instance of a class is being called as a function. And we can generate invocable or single action controllers using the same Artisan command. We just need to add the invocable option to it, or we can create them manually. Now I'm going to create a single action controller for processing a transaction. Maybe I don't want to have that logic within the transaction controller. I want to put that into its own controller or into its own action, where the sole purpose of that controller would be to process transaction. So we can call it something like process transaction controller, and then pass invocable as an option. Press enter. It has created that controller. If we open that, we see that it has PHP's magic method invoke. Now we can route to this controller by just specifying the controller's name in our web routes file. So let's define the route. We'll do route, and this would typically be a post route, but I'm just going to put it as a get route just to show it to you that it works so that I can visit the URL. But in general, this would be a post route because we're taking an action, we're not retrieving anything. I'm just defining this as a get route to avoid having a form and making a post request and all that. So I'm going to define this as transactions, transaction ID, process. And then you could, of course, pass the array that contains the controller as well as the method in it, like process transaction controller, and then invoke. And this would work, of course, but there is an easier way to do this, and that is by simply passing the fully qualified class name without an array. So we can remove this, and this basically is your single action invocable controller. So let's open the browser to test this out. We're going to go to transactions 1, 2, 3, process. And again, in real application, this would be a post route, not a get route. It's just for the demonstration purposes. So let's hit enter, and we're getting empty because we haven't returned anything in here. So let's do processed transaction and then transaction ID, and we can accept that in here like so. Let's go back, refresh, and sure enough, it works. Now let's dig into the Laravel source codes to see how the controller and its method are being dispatched. So we're going to open the kernel class from the HTTP namespace, and as you might remember from previously, there should be a method here that dispatches to route. So we have that dispatch to router right here. This is basically the method that sends requests through the router. If we see where this is used, this is in the kernel's handle method. So when we send a request to router, we have this dispatch to router method. So we go into here, Then we are calling the dispatch method on the router instance. So let's open that. And here we have dispatch to route. So we go into that. And we have run route. So let's go in here. And within the run route, we have run route within stack. So let's follow that. And here we're basically running the request through the middleware and so on. And then we are running the route on the route object when we're preparing the response. So let's go into that run method on the route object. And this is where we see something about the controller. So we see if it's a controller action, we run the controller, otherwise we run the callable. So this is basically what gets ran when it's a closure-based route, and we can actually test this. Remember, the trick is you can just add a dump here, like 1, and then let's go to the web routes file, and let's replace this back to being the closure. So we'll do it like this, return hello. Let's open the browser, let's visit this route, and sure enough, we see that one printed right here. So this means that we are executing this right here whenever it's a closure-based route. Now, if we replace this back to a controller method and refresh this, we see that we don't have that dump 1 anymore. So let's remove this and let's go through the run controller method. In here, we see that we are getting the controller dispatcher, and then we're dispatching the controller right here with the controller method. Now let's see how we're getting the controller. So if we click into this, we see if it's a controller action, get the controller class right here, and then you would have to call the method on this controller because it is resolving that controller from the container right here. And I know this may sound too confusing for you, and don't worry about it. We'll cover the service container more later on, but this is essentially what instantiates your controller class right here. So let's inspect the dispatch method to see how we're dispatching the controller method. So we're going to go not into the contract, that's just the interface. We'll go in here. So that's the controller dispatcher class. And here we're resolving the parameters. We're checking if the call action method exists. And if it does, then we call that method. Otherwise, we call whatever the method for the controller we're trying to invoke. So let's dump the controller method in here just to see what the method is that we're invoking. Let's open the browser, refresh the page, and we're getting index. Now let's see what we get for the invocable controller action. So let's press enter and we get the invoke method. Now let's see where that method gets set, because how does Laravel know that it has to invoke the invoke method? So let's remove this from here. Let's go back to the route. The controller method here returns the invoke. So controller method already knows that it's invoke. So let's go in here. And this one is calling parse controller callback. So let's go here. Parse callback, this action uses. Let's dump what this is. So we'll do dump action uses. Let's refresh. So as you can see, we have process transaction invoke. So now we need to figure out how the action uses gets set. So let's go back to the router. Let's search for uses. And we see that uses gets set right here, which is convert to controller action. Now let's dump the action here just to see what we have. Let's refresh. And we have process transaction controller. So the uses get set into whatever the fully qualified class name of the controller is in the case when we don't have an array. As you can see, it checks if the action is string, and in this case the action is string, it's not an array. So now if we go down here, we see that action controller simply gets set to action uses. Now let's see where this is called from. So we have create route method here, and this is where the action gets set. So let's dump action here just to confirm what we have. Let's refresh. And these are for the routes that we have defined. This is our route right here. So we have uses, process transaction controller, and the controller is this as well. Let's go back. Let's dig into the new route method here. So let's see, we're passing the action here, and let's check what the route does. So we're parsing the action right here. Let's see how the route action gets parsed. So we have the route action class that calls the parse method. So let's go in here and we're checking if the action is null, then we call the missing action. Then if it's callable, meaning that if it's already a closure instance, we will just set that instance as the uses property because there is nothing else we need to do when it is available. Otherwise, it needs to find it in the action list. Now let's scroll down here. If there is no uses property, if it hasn't been set, then it's going to dig through the array to find closure instance within the list. And this is where it checks if it's an invocable or not. So as you can see, it checks if it's not serialized closure, and if it's a string, if the uses is string, and in this case it is because uses at this point is set to simply the fully qualified class name of the controller. If we refresh, we get that right here. So since it is a string and it passes all these, then it simply calls that makeInvocable method. So let's dig into that makeInvocable method. And as you can see, this is where it's simply returning and adding that invoke method. If the method doesn't exist on that action, it is going to throw this exception. Otherwise, it's going to return this. And we can again easily check this by simply dumping 1, refresh, and sure enough, it's right here. So now if we go back to where this is called from, action uses now will contain the fully qualified class name as well as the invoke method. And then it gets parsed at some point, and then the method gets set to just invoke. So when we dump the method here within our controller dispatcher, that's why it's set to invoke. So I know this is a lot, and you probably thinking this is useless stuff. I'm just showing you the process, that it doesn't really take that much to dig into the source code and follow the steps to understand how it works behind the scenes. It's not that complicated. Alright, so this is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like if you enjoyed this lesson and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy coding.